Right, so this here is my new graphics card that I've just had arrive through in the post. It's one of them ones that I bid on at 2 o'clock in the morning. I think this one was 2:30 in the morning, and no one else bid. But this isn't a case of it's something decent and no one else bid. It's probably broken and doesn't work. But there's a few things that made me think maybe this is actually... See, the description itself was for a graphics card, of course, but I paid £2 and it was for a genuine desktop AMD Radeon video card and then a model name that goes to nowhere else online, just an OEM number for Lenovo and Dell and things like that. So nothing too exciting, but the description was a little bit more promising. It said, general wear and tear all over, scuffs and scratches, overall 6 out of 10. This is a 6 out of 10 graphics card. We are selling this as faulty. The graphics card sometimes does not power up and randomly shuts down, which at least implies that maybe it does something. So let's get this open and find out what graphics card did we actually get. That was easy. Here it is. Oh, it is dirty. The cooler's covered in scratches and it's a bit sticky. I'm not seeing any visible damage. Okay, there's no actual marking to say what card it is. There's some dirt and grime on the back. Why don't we plug it in and see if it actually works? That's going to be step 1. Does it actually turn on? Because it did say broken in the listing. Oh, that's not a good noise. That's a really bad noise. There's no signal coming out of it. Maybe HDMI? I've used the HDMI port rather than display, and it is on. I think I've got a copy of drivers that should support this, because it looks like a GCN card. I just hope it's cooling enough to be doing something. I didn't even think it would turn on. Honestly, I thought this would be just another one of them cards where you spend £2 on it, you take a chance, and then it just doesn't work. It just straight up doesn't want to work. But it turns out, it hates working, but it is doing something. It hasn't dropped out yet, though, which is something they said it was doing in the listing. Oh. We're going to have to zoom out. R7 that's good. For £2, that's very good. Oh, it is very not happy. We might have to take this apart. It's not feeling insanely hot either. I mean, the R7 is a funky card. Right, we'll try and run 3D Mark real quick. If it makes it through a 3D Mark test, we know it's stable enough, and then we can actually try and make this do something. I don't want to be hearing any excuses that you can't get cheap graphics cards, because this one's working. It got quieter. It got louder. You can hear it in the distance. If you went to the charity shop or eBay, that is so loud. Oh, it is just getting worse. It did pass. Let's turn this off and see if we can repair the card. So, inside the card, things didn't actually look too bad. I mean, obviously, we knew the thing was relatively dirty, but we could see that from the top side. And the main thing is that although the card worked and it made it through 3D Mark, it sounded awful. And it's also worth noting, the seller wasn't lying about the card dropping out, as it would cut out at random. I mean, after the first boot, it was mostly stable, but the thing is, if you were doing anything intensive for longer than 5 minutes, take running Unigine Valley and seeing if it'll, stay stable for half an hour, it would just crash out and there was nothing you could do. The only thing is though, underneath the cooler, someone had tried to fix this before, because usually on these cheap old cards, especially OEM ones, the thermal paste is baked on. But this was more or less brand new. Keep in mind, these things are usually neglected cards. They never get thermal paste changes unless something goes wrong. So whoever was in here last assumed it was thermals, and given the sound of the fan, I don't blame them for thinking that, but their fix clearly didn't work. This is a very bodged set of fixes, but there was no point baking the card as heat wasn't the problem here. As much as the fan was awful and could grind to a halt, it didn't seem to be heat causing this problem, and there weren't any issues with the core or VRAM and things like that, as changing the clocks, admittedly putting them up would make it crash, but putting them down wouldn't solve the problem either. So what I ended up doing was giving this thing a thorough scrub down in the sink, because maybe there was some gunk on the board causing problems, and letting that dry out in the sun. Then I gave it a thorough clean down with brake cleaner, mostly because I'd run out of electrical cleaner and this was close enough. But what are we going to do about that fan? Because they are a specialist unit that is meant to fit on there. Well, this was a very easy fix.
because I left it soaking in 5W40 Febby Bilstein engine oil, because if the bearing is on its way out, a good soak in oil really isn't going to do any harm, and all that was really left to do now was to leave our fixes overnight and see if a thorough clean and some engine oil was enough to resurrect the card.
So I very crudely refurbished the card. So it's been cleaned, new thermal paste, technically oil in the bearing for the fan, and it should all be working. Now, it is a lot cleaner than it was. It's a lot less manky than it was. It certainly has a nice gleam to it. It's nice and shiny now, which is a mixture of brake cleaner and 5W40 Febby Bilstein oil. But now we need to put this in the computer and make sure it still turns on. Moment of truth is, does the fan make a hideous noise? Oh, it's a lot quieter. There you go, soaking in engine oil. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. Still not perfect, but it was never going to be perfect. So fan speed on 100. It's now like a little lawnmower. It is definitely a lot happier. Performance, though, is looking brilliant, to be honest. I wonder if we can finish the driver install. Right, so you join me after a couple of days where I've been testing the graphics card that we got for £2, and it turns out that with the strangest load of fixes I've ever bothered to try, it now works fine. It doesn't crash, the fan is still a little bit iffy, but then again it beats it grinding itself to death and then eventually stopping. It just makes this noise under full load, which isn't too bad. I mean, it's been running for a little while now, it's running at 66 degrees, and that is as loud as it gets, so it's a huge improvement from where we used to be. But in terms of the actual graphics card we've got, I brought up the specifications because I was a little bit confused over just what kind of card this was, because it doesn't look like it's got any specific branding on it. Turns out, it's actually an R7 manufactured by MSI, but it was an OEM-only variant that came with double the VRAM of their standard R7 350. So it's got 2GB of GDDR5, which caught me off guard. The only reason I know this is because I've already done the benchmarks, so I know how it performs. And remarkably, it did far better than I expected. Now, of course, we are running with modded drivers, and it's nice to see that the crashing issue has resolved itself. It's not a good overclocker, this card, though, because usually I'll be saying about now, why don't we do some overclocking, see how much power we can get out of it. This is as good as it gets. Stock settings on a £2 graphics card is as good as we are going to get here, because, frankly, I think this chip has been cooked. I think that fan was doing exactly what it's been doing for me, for its previous owner, which is where it will run, and then it will grind itself into a halt, and suddenly the card is silent, and then about 20 minutes later, after the card overheats, it dies. But if you're just on the desktop, the card ends up running at excess of 95 degrees with no cooling. So the moment you launch an application, it just dies, just outright. So I think the card is pretty much cooked, but it's stable and it is now working. So the real question is, just how good is a £2 graphics card when you throw it up in to the benchmarks?
Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5, which was the legacy version, and we were able to run it with medium and high settings, predominantly higher settings though, and that even went as far as higher textures. Overall, it actually ran fairly decently in 1080p with 54 FPS on average, with 49 FPS 1% lows. Generally, it looked and ran pretty good, which is no surprise given that these types of cards, well, they were released well into GTA 5 being just as popular as it is today. So GTA 5 and games like that, it's starting off without a problem. For once though, GTA Online actually ran absolutely fine. We were seeing very much the same FPS we saw in single player with the exact same settings. Now, don't get me wrong, it was slightly more unstable in places and our average was ever so slightly lower, but GTA Online did tend to run fairly well. It's worth noting that I was struggling to get into any lobbies that actually had a higher amount of players, so this was the only instance I had where we had a relatively full lobby. Generally though, when we were in smaller lobbies, the FPS would be even higher than it used to be in single player, which is how GTA Online always used to work. Just, it's been a while since I've actually seen it run like that. So GTA Online, even in 2025, isn't a problem on a £2 Radeon R7. And now, because GTA 5 has so many different versions, I went through and tested GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which actually ran relatively good with 41 FPS on average and 1% lows of 38, so it was relatively stable and looked fairly good. The only downside was we had to run with normal textures rather than high textures because the VRAM limit was quickly exceeded and it made the game a stuttering mess. It's also worth noting that although this game supports FSR, the implementation, especially on these older cards, can actually degrade performance and make the image look worse, so it was better off sticking with a native 1080p image. The game doesn't actually want to start by default though on Windows 11 with the Radeon R7s. It's probably the same for every version of Windows, but it comes up with an excuse of not having the right version of DirectX 12. The solution to this is very much like it used to be back in the Windows XP days. You grab the DLLs for the right version of DirectX, dump them with the EXE, and for some reason that makes the game work. Even with Cyberpunk's rather generous benchmark, it was completely unplayable. I mean, 768p with the lowest settings was seeing 23 FPS on average, and anytime there was anything actually demanding happening on screen, we were seeing 15 FPS. But the good news is, it did show that the card was capable of making a relatively stable frame rate in places. And it's not like I advocate for playing games like this, but if you were really in a pinch and just wanted to play Cyberpunk, well, you can lock the game at 15 FPS, and you can turn on frame generation. Now, it didn't look brilliant, especially in a lot of places where there was quick movement, but it did take the game from a stuttering mess through to something that seemed smooth enough to be playable. Latency wasn't amazing, but it was just about controllable, as I did try and play through a decent chunk of the game to make sure you could actually control things. So Cyberpunk is possible, you're just going to have to deal with the world turning into soup beneath you with frame generation turned on. It's probably of no surprise that Counter-Strike 2 actually ran and looked fairly good. Now, we were using the usual competitive settings that I've used for years, which was low everything and high shadows, and this was in the 720p resolution. And quite quickly the R7 350 became a limit, and this was the loudest the card got because it was the highest amount of frames it was churning out at any point, and it really was working overtime here. But still, we saw 106 FPS on average, which could go down to the mid-70s when flames and smokes were going on. Actually playing the game in a competitive setting, the frame rate was liable to be higher than this, purely because there is less happening in a competitive environment. So Counter-Strike 2 is relatively playable and quite enjoyable on a £2 graphics card. Red Dead Redemption 2 is one that really struggles on certain cards, because we've seen this playable on a Matrox C680, we've seen it playable on even higher clock 750 graphics cards from AMD, we've seen it playable on the R7 450, which is the next two versions up from this card, but mechanically it's the exact same. But here, on the R7 350 with unlimited clock speed, we were seeing 25 FPS on average, and this was with low settings in 768p. It's also a nightmare to configure this game down, so this is about as good as you're going to get. It was controllable given our frame times were actually remarkably decent, but I wouldn't exactly recommend playing the game like this. Although I did play a good chunk of it, I think I got 15-20 minutes of footage just to make sure that it was controllable. I did try running the new Forza Motorsport just to see how it would get on, because I actually want to see this game launch on something I test, and this time we made it through to the settings menu, where we are using a new frame rate metric, which is frames per minute. It got 1 frame per minute. Genuinely, this was completely unusable on the R7 350, and I assumed it would work, but unfortunately here, Forza Motorsport is a no-go. Fortunately, I did have Forza 6 Apex installed, which I'm not even too sure you can download from the Microsoft Store, but I've still got it for some reason, which goes to show that optimization really has gone out the window, because this game looked and ran fantastically. It was a locked 30 FPS, but it very rarely dropped away from this point, and we were seeing medium and high settings in 1080p. Honestly, we probably had enough headroom that we could have probably targeted 1440p and maybe even higher settings, and it would have ran absolutely fine, because this is what DirectX 12 was meant to be about. The idea that these older graphics cards could achieve performance that you would never expect from them due to a new API, something that's now gone out the window with support being dropped all over the place. In terms of actual car games that people play though, I did launch BeamNG, which was running in the most intensive of scenarios with the jungle map, and we were seeing a good mixture of low and medium settings, predominantly medium settings keep in mind because it did look rather good, in the 720p resolution. No, it doesn't look as good as Forza did, but people actually play this game, and it did run relatively well with 36 FPS on average. Keep in mind in simpler maps you'd be seeing 50 to 60 FPS, so it's good to know that even when this game gets incredibly tough, you're still going to be seeing playable frame rates and rather decent settings. PUBG making my point again about the Radeon side of these cheap cards actually being kept alive by DirectX 12, because this game used to be hardly playable on these lower end Radeons. We were talking absolute lowest render scale, seeing 15 to 20 FPS. But thanks to the magic of DirectX 12, we see pretty much a 100% increase in performance, so now we can achieve low settings in a real 720p. Don't be wrong, the game looks absolutely hideous, but it is actually relatively playable, and as the player count dropped, well, you'd be seeing higher and higher frames. So PUBG, actually playable, and even when it's quite intensive, you'll be seeing 33 FPS on average. Hitman 3 is a remarkably good looking game, and also one that once again utilises DirectX 12 properly. Now I'm not going to claim it was brilliant because there's only so much you can tweak this game down, so low settings in 720p did prove to be our best option. And during some intensive parts of the built-in benchmark we could see FPS that was in the mid-20s. However, most of the time it'd be hovering just over 30 FPS, and the same was reminiscent of how it ran in-game. So Hitman looks and runs relatively well, even on this cheap Radeon. So I'm being relatively impressed so far because most things I've thrown at it, as long as you're willing to configure them down, are actually running far better than they should. For those of you who don't remember the likes of the R7 350 and its multiple rebrands, well, it ran games pretty good when it came out. Generally on release, you were expecting high settings in 1080p and you'd be seeing anywhere between 30 to 60 FPS depending on the title. So Skyrim Anniversary was no different to this, where we saw 38 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 28 when there was lots going on or when you were in towns and cities and things like that, and overall it looked and ran pretty good. In terms of newer titles like Bannerlord, you will have to drop the resolution back to 720p. That's not because the game can't run it at 1080p, it's just that you have to turn off a lot of settings to make it playable, and even then you don't see as good of a frame rate as you see here. So really, 720p, medium and high settings, 37 FPS on average, and this was during the benchmark battle. So in actual gameplay, from the late game onwards, you know it's going to be playable and you know it's going to be fine, but that early game, you'd be seeing even higher frames than this, and it looks pretty decent to boot. When it comes to older games, you're not just testing the performance, you're testing the compatibility and how it runs them. And Fable: The Lost Chapters is notorious for having issues with the higher particle effects setting, especially on some new cards. I think even on newer Radeons, it's affecting them. So if you wanted to get into a lot of these classic games, well, an R7 250, or 350, which is what this one actually is, even a dying one like this that we bought for nothing, is capable of running these games at ultra settings at 1440p with over 150 FPS in places. So it's nice to see that Fable in games like that will run at extraordinarily high FPS with ultra settings. Another classic game that I wanted to test was Star Wars Battlefront, because with some of the effects going on in places, it can prove rather intensive, even on some newer cards I've tested. But here for the Radeon, ultra settings once again in 1440p, and we're seeing 112 FPS on average, which would go even higher than this when you weren't in the midst of a heavy battle. 1% lows were around 80 when there was lots going on and lots of NPCs fighting you, and it's having to draw a lot of textures and models and things like that, but ultimately, Battlefront and these older games, it doesn't matter what you throw it up against, you are looking at ultra settings in 1440p or 4K, which is the first time we've said that about a cheap graphics card. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, you can definitely tell that I'm running it on the graphics card because I forgot to hit record on my capture card when I was doing this. But we were seeing Ultra settings, which is what I wanted to target here, because the idea of running Crysis on Ultra on a card that was this cheap and this broken just seemed impressive to me. And we saw 43 FPS on average, which could of course go down to the high 30s when there was lots going on. It was only when things got really bad you'd be seeing around 32 FPS, which is still more than playable, especially in Crysis. And when nothing was going on at all, well, you could be seeing upwards of 50 to 60 FPS, which I know is only in 720p, but this game does look pretty good in this resolution, especially with these settings. Overall benchmark performance, given that we couldn't really budge this thing from stock clocks, was actually rather impressive for a couple of reasons. Mostly because this is based on the now 13-year-old design from the HD 7750, and it also cost us next to nothing. That's the main takeaway, is all of this performance is from a £2 graphics card. And yes, it was resurrected using less than stellar methods, but it is working and it is stable. This thing doesn't crash anymore. Sadly, it seems that a lot of the R7 350, and by saying that, a lot of its GCN1 counterparts, well, they've been left out of running the latest and greatest games. I mean, take Oblivion Remastered for example. I'd imagine that we should be able to at least launch the game and try and test it or something, but even after a good hour of tweaking things around with the game's files, the closest I could get to it running was a change in errors from no DirectX 12 found to just a fatal error crash, which with Oblivion Remastered, from what I played of it, is not exactly nailing anything down. Which was certainly a bit of a shame. But the reality is that a lot of the most popular games out there on Steam still run absolutely fine on a card that we picked up for next to nothing, and there's plenty more deals like this going on. In fact, I've grabbed a couple more in case people want to see them. Sure, it's not as powerful as last year's HD 5850 we got for 25p, but it takes us years to get graphics cards that cheap. These are a lot more common, and it's a lot sketchier than using that card, but it is working. The drivers on here work fantastically well, as they're the modified GCN ones from the Nemez team, and thanks to that basic DirectX 12 support, as much as it's a hindrance and not something you can rely on in the latest of games, when it does work, there are free performance gains to be had just from having it there in the first place.
So there we have it, the £2 graphics card, which isn't a video I planned on making, but these cheap graphics card videos are never videos I plan on making because they're not interesting enough to really cover the history on. I mean, the R7 350, we've already sort of recapped it in my video on the R7 450. It's a refresh of a refresh of a refresh that, for some reason, this one was made by MSI and they gave it double the VRAM, which turns out is actually helping it in 2025. I mean, its main limit is that AMD's fine wine is pretty much over now. DirectX 12 is very much limited to what games will decide to launch on it, and I'm sure there are a lot of games it probably could just about run if you tweak the settings low enough, but they're not allowed to because the APIs simply won't launch on the card. There's a few like GTA Enhanced Edition where you can drop the DLL files in and trick it into starting, but ultimately, for £2, I'm quite happy. I mean, I'm sat here next to it, it's relatively quiet compared to how it was when we first got it. Crysis here running at ultra settings, which is not something you ever expect from a £2 graphics card, and it runs old games at 1440p at over 100 FPS. So GCN was really a good one for this tier of cards because they just hung in there. But at the end of the day, it's a £2 graphics card, it works alright, and we've been able to do some pretty decent gaming on it. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and hopefully we'll get some more cheap graphics cards. I know I've bid on one and it looks terrible. So if I win that auction, we'll be taking a look at some more very cheap bargain bin graphics cards. But till then, thank you very much for watching and good night.